Welcome back, everybody. Look, up here in Washington this month, the new hotness is basically trying to get Texas to become a centralized energy grid, just like everybody else. Democrats hate independence. They're really not a big fan of it. They don't like you to be independent. They don't like your state to be independent. They want you connected to the Borg, for you Star Trekkies out there. And so... Look, that's the big conversation. There's like multiple hearings on what happened in Texas and having ERCOT up here and answer questions to the federal government, which is kind of strange in itself, right? There should definitely be a lot of hearings in Texas. There already have been, and some very serious conversations about what needs to change. And there are some things that need to change around the edges. And I have a lot of ideas on that. And I think you've heard those ideas on previous podcasts, and we'll talk about some of them today. But what the Democrats really want is to regulate Texas under FERC. FERC is F-E-R-C, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And so the big question is, would it have improved the situation in Texas if FERC had been in charge, right? Because none of these power outages, none of these rolling blackouts, none of these problems ever happen anywhere else in the United States, only in Texas, right? Not so sure that's right. So I wanted to have an expert who knows FERC inside and out. Neil Chatterjee is our guest today. He's the former chairman of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, so we might know a thing or two. He was the chairman under Trump. Prior to that, served as an advisor to Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, Cocaine Mitch, where he played an integral role in the passage of major energy, highway, and agricultural legislation. Okay, I could keep going on his bio. He knows his stuff. Neil, thanks so much for being back on the show. You're a repeat offender.
Thanks for having me back.
So, and you're still on FERC, right? So how exactly does that change as administrations change?
So I still serve on as a commissioner. Still have a vote. Still have the ability to influence the agenda. Big distinction between being chair and being a commissioner is I no longer get to set the agenda. That said, one vote out of five, I can still be impactful and intend to stay and be constructive and make sure that we build on the good work that we did the past 4 years heading into the future.
So, yeah, and I want to get to the politics of FERC in the second half of this, but first let's just dive right into Texas and answer that fundamental question in broad terms. Would Texas have been better off if FERC had been regulating it versus the state regulation?
Look, you've already got people calling for Texas to interconnect, to come under FERC jurisdiction. And I think it's way too premature to jump to a conclusion like that. I think we need to really dig in and examine the root cause of what happened here, why it happened, what were the factors that contributed to what was a genuine humanitarian crisis. And once we make that determination, then figure out a path forward. You noted at the start that while we had this cold weather event in Texas, this isn't the only time, even this year, that the grid was challenged. We saw this past summer in California, where extreme heat and wildfires led to similar challenges to their grid. They are connected to their neighbors in the West, and due to the fact that their neighbors were going through similar extreme heat events, the connectivity didn't necessarily help them in their instance. And so we just need to do a careful, thoughtful analysis before we jump to a conclusion as to what happened with ERCOT being connected and also with ERCOT's market design. There's a lot to examine here.
Yeah, and that seems, when we talk about changes, there are some changes to ERCOT market design that are being proposed that there seems to be some consensus on. But first, I want to kind of just still dig into the arguments being made on why ERCOT should be connected. And it seems to me the biggest one is, well, if it was connected, then you could buy energy from Louisiana and Oklahoma and New Mexico and import it in. But you can't do that because you're not connected. And but last time I checked, they were down too. They lost a bunch of power too, so it didn't seem like there was any energy to buy.
So again, these are complex dynamics that we need to understand it. Texas, the reason that ERCOT and Texas have been successful to date is because Texas's sheer size. You've got the population that drives demand, and then you've got abundant resources to meet that demand. And so the Texas only grid has had its successes and has had benefits to Texans.
So what are some of those? Well, sorry, go ahead.
Well, sure. No, I mean, look.
What are the pros and cons? I mean, it's not obviously just perfect. So, like, what are the pros and cons, and how do you explain to somebody who just has no clue about electrical grids how Texas is different? What this even means to have your own grid?
So, I think in terms of Texas and its structure, ERCOT has been able to design a market that has been effective for Texans, for consumers, and for reliability. Clearly something went wrong here. This cold weather event should have been anticipated. There was a event about a decade ago. FERC and NERC did a report making some recommendations on things that Texas could do to prevent this kind of thing from happening in the future. Perhaps all those things weren't followed through on, and people are pointing to that as a reason that there ought to be federal jurisdiction. Let's see. Some people are making the case where, there should have been investments in winterization and those investments weren't made. Well, was that the sole cause of what happened here, or were there other elements that contributed to this? There's also some merit to interconnecting. Look, an interconnected grid, stronger interconnections do create a stronger grid. And if Texas were connected to the rest of the grid in the continental U.S., or it could even be better connected to Mexico, that, may have played a role in this. But until we understand the root cause, I'm not ready to come out and say that it's time for Texas to connect to the grid. And ultimately, that will be a decision that Texans make. And I think they'll make that decision based on the facts and the evidence and the analysis of this crisis.
Yeah. And it's even if it was true that hey, FERC said, you might winterize and Texas was like, it's really never that cold here, so we didn't winterize. That alone is such a weak argument for an entirely different structure. And people also leave out the fact that if you were to all of a sudden say, okay, FERC regulates you, now interconnect between other states, it's not like you just flip a switch, right? You have to build billions of dollars worth of transmission lines because that connection is very physical in nature.
And it would involve and implicate markets. Could be some benefits there. At FERC, we've always permitted regional solutions and approaches, and Texas would have some flexibility, but it would be a very, very complex undertaking. And again, I just think that, and this happens in the aftermath of a calamity like this.
Yeah. People want action. Action.
They want to view it through their particular lens. And if you're for expanded FERC jurisdiction, you want, FERC to assert jurisdiction here. If you are opposed to a particular fuel source, pick your poison. Everybody failed across the board here.
Yeah.
And you're seeing different people say, well, this is because gas wellheads froze, or coal piles froze, or a nuclear plant got tripped offline, or windmills weren't able to deliver because they were freezing up. I think everyone needs to calm down, take a step back, allow the experts to dig in and figure out what went wrong here, and then make a determination on what to do from there. I get nervous when people start proposing solutions before we even have gotten to the root cause of what went wrong.
I think that's fair. I mean, we've been investigating this for a while. I think there's a growing consensus on root causes, and like many complex situations, it's a whole number of things. And look, in policy, there's trade-offs. There are no real solutions. There are only trade-offs. That's why I asked, it obviously, if it was obviously better for every state to have its own energy grid, then every state would have its own energy grid. But there's pros and cons. And it is certainly not clear to me that
not every state has Texas's population and natural resources.
Exactly. And like you said, all energy sources fail to an extent. They didn't all fail equally. I'm going to read Michael Schellenberger's tweet just from a little bit ago. The capacity factors for nuclear, natural gas, coal, and wind during the cold snap were 79%, 55%, 58%, and 14% respectively. So yes, everything failed, but the lesson you learn, but you almost have no renewables, and you don't even expect renewables in situations like this, which should kind of give people pause. Like in any, and now let's get into, take a step back and, what does a properly run grid look like? And we're obviously not doing it right in Texas. But the question is, what is going wrong and how do you fix it? And it would seem to me that if I'm looking at what kind of energy has been added to the grid, or what kind of generation, let's say, has been added to the grid over time, large increase in renewables, almost no increase in baseload power, baseload being defined as gas, coal, and nuclear, things that you can make work all the time. Now, obviously not everything worked all the time here, but based on those percentage numbers that I just read, these thermal generation power sources still perform a heck of a lot better than renewables, right? And even on a normal day, sometimes there's just no wind and sun. So that's just a fact of renewables. So you always have to have at least, and disagree with this if you want, but don't you always have to have at least 100% of maybe at least average demand, and so maybe 130% of average demand that is capable of being switched on just like that? If you want people to have power all the time, would that be an accurate thing to say if you're planning a grid?
I mean, it's very complicated. A lot goes on at ERCOT and in the respective other RTOs to just make sure that demand and supply are exactly even. On the U.S. grid, supply and demand are exactly equal when the grid's frequency is at 60 hertz. Mm-hmm. So the market operators
you're speaking in different language now for the audience.
I'm getting into the weeds here.
No, but tell us because I've heard that before from other experts. We talk about the frequency. When the frequency starts to jump up and down, it caused power generators to actually trip. So power plants tripped and they turned off, and that was a problem. So I think the frequency thing that you're talking about is actually pretty important. But we need to understand it.
I'll try to make it as easily digestible as possible. Market operators, they're not only clearing energy supply every 5 minutes, but they also rely on generators to provide something that we call ancillary services. This is something like frequency response and regulation to ensure on a moment by moment basis that the frequency remains at or near that 60 hertz and the system is balanced. So the easiest way to digest what I just said, the grid is constantly monitored and the grid operators extremely technologically advanced control rooms to maintain this equilibrium.
And when it comes to ERCOT, it's been hailed as one of the most efficient in maintaining that equilibrium, making sure that the supply and demand are met perfectly. You're not putting too much energy into the grid at any one time, or let's say too many electrons onto the grid at any one time. And we have a pricing mechanism that does that. And it does mean we have lower than average energy prices or electricity prices as well in Texas. So there's some benefits, but as I dive into this really deeply, it's this pricing structure that we have, the formula that is used to create the price. It is largely affected by probabilities. Okay, so probability that your generation will work at any given time. Now, when you're talking about gas, coal, and nuclear, that probability is 100%, right? Unless there's a once-in-a-century freeze, okay, then it decreases. But it's generally at about 100%. That probability for wind and solar varies dramatically, which causes dramatic price variations. Those price variations absolutely benefit renewables, wind and solar, to the detriment of other baseload power sources, gas, coal, and nuclear. The reason being is average pricing, and at the time and the price point at which any given generation can make a profit. So this helps explain why we haven't seen a lot of investment in new power plants in Texas. Power plants meaning gas, nuclear, and coal. And the question is, how sustainable is that given our population growth? That was a complicated point, but
there's a couple of factors here. So Secretary Perry actually raised this issue back in the fall of 2017, and the Department of Energy proposed a rule at FERC to basically compensate power plants for their attribute of having on-site fuel. And that proceeding didn't meet legal muster and was actually with 3 Republican commissioners, including myself. We voted it down 5-0, but we opened a new proceeding to look at these questions around grid resilience. I was frustrated. We had that docket open for a couple of years. There was a lot of meaningful work and input that went into it. We couldn't get consensus to move forward with it during my time as chair, but I still thought there was value in the docket. We actually, a couple of weeks ago, voted 4-1 to close the docket. I dissented, and in my separate statement, what I wrote was essentially that, this isn't about politics. This isn't about trying to favor one fuel source over another, that there are real serious questions that need to be examined here. The new chairman a week later, opened a new docket to examine the challenges being posed by climate change on the grid. That's actually the same concept that we were looking at when I framed it up as an examination of grid resilience. And so I'm hopeful to import the record that we built in that original resilience proceeding into this new dialogue. It's a worthwhile conversation that we are having, that we need to have, that Secretary Perry started. It got unfortunately politicized. If we take the politics out of it and calmly and rationally examine these questions on how the grid needs to be designed to withstand these kind of events in the future, I think it's a very, very important inquiry to focus on. To the latter part of your question about pricing and the ERCOT model, this is actually something that we are focusing on right now as we speak, on capacity markets in the Eastern RTOs. In each of those RTOs,
tell us what an RTO is. Nobody speaks that language.
Regional Transmission Organization.
So it's like
markets.
Yeah, so regional ERCOTs, basically, right? Just
that's exactly that's
different
that's
electric grids. Okay,
it's a good way to explain it. So in those regions, we recognize that the energy and ancillary service markets revenues were not high enough to provide the revenues needed for competitive and for the needed generation to remain operational. Yeah. And so in those regions, we approved something called a capacity market that serves the basic function of ensuring resource adequacy, that you procure enough resources to meet demand. It's like an insurance policy, if you will.
You're paying a power plant merely to exist.
To be able to
be ready to give you power when you say turn on.
To meet demand on the peak day of the year with a reserve margin added. And by providing that additional source of revenue to generators, it addresses this missing money concern that I just described from the energy and ancillary services markets. These markets pay generators to be available in case they are needed, in addition to paying them for generating electricity. In ERCOT, they chose a different path. Rather than setting up a capacity market, ERCOT developed something called shortage pricing, which basically means when the market is stressed in real time, they produce extremely high energy prices that will be able to attract investment in generation and negate the need for any capacity markets. This was always viewed by economists as the most efficient and elegant solution, but I gotta say the cold weather event might have changed a lot of minds here, including my own. I'm not saying that Texas requires a capacity market that has the same design as some of the markets we have on the East Coast. Indeed, if Texas were to adopt a capacity market, it may look a lot different. But I'm thinking some forward price signal may be needed here.
It's been talked about a lot, and we're the only state that doesn't have it. We're the only ones. Now, in practice, this means we probably have one of the greenest. When it comes to carbon emissions and emphasis on a renewable, we probably have one of the greenest, structures out there. If I look at a graph right now that we have planned capacity being added, right now we have barely any reserve capacity. It's a really big problem, less than 10%. We're getting up to almost 30% in the next 5 years, but where does that reserve capacity come from? Entirely from wind. Entirely. That's not reserve capacity because you can't just turn it on if you want it. You can hope that it's on, but it's a hope. I think wind on average operates at about 18 in Texas, about 18% of its total capacity. Or maybe it's 18% it's giving to the grid at any given time. I think it's actually on average, maybe perhaps even less than that on total capacity. These are complicated terms, but they matter. And so the question is, do we add that capacity fee? It would raise prices on the average a little bit. I mean, it's sometimes you have these price spikes in Texas and other data I've seen. These price spikes are getting longer, which is a problem and maybe an indication that we just don't have that base load to get the price back down quickly. A lot of people are worried, by the way, about their personal electricity prices that month skyrocketing. You shouldn't worry about that too much. First of all, not that many residents are on. I think I've heard, and I stand to be corrected if so, but about 99% of people are not on this variable pricing mechanism. That's usually for big industrial people who use a ton of energy and are monitoring it all the time. So they like the variable spikes because on average they end up cheaper. And so they're talking about average prices. But for a household, you can't afford $1,000 bill all of a sudden. That's just not how we're. But households pay a fixed rate. So it's important for people to know that. And the state of Texas is making sure that people aren't going to be slapped with these bills. And we're working through that. People should just understand that, I think.
Yeah, I know there's been some conversation about repricing and rerunning the market, having like a cap. In some areas, I believe the governor weighed in with the legislature on this yesterday, and I think there's no doubt about it that these issues are going to be lingering for a while. Just to put it in perspective,
well, you can't reprice, right? I mean, that would be a disaster.
You'd have to rerun the market, and that's obviously a pretty contentious thing to do. But some folks have called for it.
It's like if you reprice milk, is everybody going to go back to their grocery store and get a return for it? You know, I mean, because that's basically what you're talking about. You can't do
electricity. It's not milk; it's a different commodity. But to put it in perspective for folks in Texas and other of your viewers, listeners of this podcast, we recently voted out orders tied to the California energy crisis in the early 2000s. I was joking around with my 9-year-old daughter the other day that if she follows in daddy's footsteps and is a FERC commissioner in the future, she may be voting on cases tied to this issue in Texas. It is going to take years and years to sort this out.
Yeah. What about other states? So tell us, so in California they have rolling blackouts, not doing well. FERC does regulate California. FERC did regulate Ohio, New York in 2003. Something happened in Ohio, caused blackouts in New York. So, I mean, clearly this happens, but like, what are the underlying reasons behind these things happening? Let's focus on California because, again, from we've been diving into this constantly for the last few weeks, and it almost seemed to me like Texas took too many lessons from California as far as changing where we rely on the unreliables for our energy sources, which is fine on maybe normal times, but something puts us out of the norm and we're screwed. So, but walk us through what are the problems in California and how are they getting fixed?
Yeah, so the majority of recent outages in California have been caused by wildfires and heat-related weather events. Specifically, this past summer, California had a significant heat wave that caused load shed for, I believe, a couple of nights when solar output decreased and before wind output kicked in. So for California, it appears that the system was designed to meet the peak demand, but not the net peak demand, which in layman's terms means that the system likely needed to better account for the output of intermittent resources like wind and solar, which are really important part of the resource mix, but also the reserve margin, meaning the amount of available excess power supply on the system to meet unexpected events, was arguably too low. And so in California, you had a situation where I think they retired some assets and the balancing resources weren't yet ready and available, and that led to their market design challenges.
Right, retire assets. Do you mean gas assets?
Correct.
So a power plant that uses gas to generate electricity is retired. And look, you can't, there's a floor to this, right? I mean, I think Texas is learning this hard lesson. California has already been learning this hard lesson. There is a ceiling to, there's an upper limit on how much wind and solar makes sense to build. You can keep building it, but the reality is it all goes down at once, because wind and sun just aren't consistent. And there has to be a floor to how much assets you can retire. Assets meaning gas, coal, or nuclear. And maybe other, maybe hydro. Hydro seems reliable as well. I'm really fascinated by the geothermal technology we're seeing, and also repurposing of waste reformation, I think is the right term. There's a lot of other reliable sources that are carbon free that are coming online, which are really fascinating. Again, I don't know why, for the life of me, we don't focus on those instead of saying, it would be better though. Here's a better idea. Let's manufacture tons and tons of turbines and solar panels from rare earth minerals in China. We'll import them all. We will lay waste to thousands and thousands of acres just to have intermittent energy because it's clean. I don't know, man. That seems crazy.
Look, I'm all for market-based approaches and solutions to decarbonization. I think when you have challenges is when, and we're experiencing this in other regions of the country, when state legislatures come in and pick winners and losers amongst fuel sources and offer subsidies to their preferred fuel sources, that winds up distorting markets. And to me, markets function best when you have true competition and the low-cost resources get dispatched. You have capacity markets to ensure resource adequacy with that focus on reliability. And, I think if you let the engineers and the economists and the market experts kind of oversee these markets, they tend to work efficiently. It's when, and we've struggled with this at the commission, when states start to weigh in with policies that impact markets outside of their own borders. We've had to make some tough calls here at FERC where we have weighed in these situations. Look, I'm a conservative. I believe fundamentally in states' rights and that states ought to be able to make decisions about their local energy futures. But when those state policy decisions are implicating resources in other states, I thought those market distortions need to be addressed. And we took some steps at the commission to weigh in there.
Yeah, I mean, an example being the production tax credits for wind and solar. Wind and solar get hundreds of times more subsidies than, say, nuclear, another carbon-free power source that is also reliable. And so, the question is why.
One distinction there, that's a federal tax credit.
Right.
I'm talking about when state-level tax credits or subsidies start distorting markets because.
So does California do that credit, too? How much do they do?
Well, they do. Some of these states have really robust credits for their preferred resources. Okay. And the difference when you have state credits versus a federal credit is applied everywhere. Yeah. When state A subsidizes a resource that inhibits state D's generators from being dispatched, to me, that is an outcome that merits, FERC.
You got something to say about that. Yeah, I mean, look, in Texas is what I'm told. At $22 per unit of energy, gas turns off. They're just like, we can't make a profit under this. So once this price goes below that, we're done. We turn our plant off. Now they have to build gas plants that can turn off and on, which means you have a less efficient gas plant. Ideally, a power plant just stays on and hums. Nuclear can't turn off, so sometimes they just operate at a loss. coal kind of can, right? But it takes some while to spin it back up. Wind can operate at negative $20 because of these subsidies. And that's just the federal subsidies. I don't think we have state subsidies in Texas. So, but again, our pricing mechanisms are a form of a subsidy to renewables. It makes it a more attractive investment, which is why you see over the next few years, everything new getting built is going to be wind. And as our demand continues to creep up, because of course it will, because we have more people moving to Texas, then I can watch this on a graph that's been done by some analytics that I've seen. We're getting to this point where our baseload power, again, the stuff that you can turn on right away, won't meet that demand. And so that's a huge risk. I mean, it's a huge, I can't even believe that we would, and now I have faith that the Texas legislature is talking about this, and I think switching up some incentives around, and I think a scalpel is necessary for the changes. I definitely don't think a hammer is. I've also heard great ideas, maybe respond to this, is we probably talked about this last time, but there's a lot of flaring that goes on in the Permian Basin. Use that natural gas. Use the natural gas from processing plants, and put that into a pipeline and use it. I mean, wouldn't that make sense as well? That's much easier than building an entirely new plant.
Yeah, look, I mean, one of the interesting challenges that you guys are having in Texas, I was down in Austin, I guess in December, and it was amazing to see you guys are picking California's pocket every day. And you're having all these businesses move out of California, coming and establishing headquarters and a foothold in Texas, and it's been obviously clearly very invigorating for the local economy in Texas. But these folks are bringing their policies with them from California to Texas, and I just was amused by that. It's like you're fleeing California because of the tax and regulatory environment there, coming to Texas, but then you get situated in Texas and you start to incorporate the policies and push for the policies that caused you to leave California in the first place. I was amused by that whole paradigm.
Yeah, and I hope in reality it doesn't play out that way. I think a lot of, there's more Republicans in California than any other state, so I'll give them that. Unclear how they want to vote when they get here. Well, respond to what I just said, because the other problem, FERC regulates the building of pipelines too, right?
That is correct.
So the thing the Democrats seem to hate the most, and this is pretty clear from Biden's first executive orders, is pipelines. They hate pipelines. It's like Trump and pipelines. Like, these are the things the Democrats fear the most, it seems like to me. Even though pipelines are a safer, more a cleaner way to transport oil and gas. So, this is a confusing policy debate for me. I don't know why. Canceling Keystone offers zero benefits to the environment. That oil is getting transported one way or another. It's just going to be on thousands and thousands of trucks. What is it, like every 20 miles of pipeline keeps like thousands, there's a crazy number, like thousands of trucks off the road. Rail also. But are we going to, over the next few years, because I just offered a pretty good solution, right? It would actually reduce carbon emissions drastically, because flaring, you're just wasting the gas. Well, that's a carbon emission. So why don't we capture it and use it? So we would reduce carbon emissions and have more reliable power sources. Seems like a win-win, but will this administration's FERC even let us build pipelines? What's going to happen?
So I'm in negotiations with the new chairman and the leadership of the commission, and I'm cautiously optimistic that there's going to be a path forward here, because we got to have it. Taking a step back, markets have delivered great results for the American consumer, for the economy, and for the environment. We are continually reducing carbon emissions in the U.S. power sector because of these market forces. And for all of the excitement legitimately around the business case for clean energy going forward, it has all been built on the back of gas and gas infrastructure. And the reality is we are going to need this critical energy infrastructure going forward. And it's untenable to think that this commission would not approve any new certificate applications for gas infrastructure. The question will be, what changes to the approach the commission has taken the last few years will be necessary to garner the support to approve a pipeline. There are some legitimate concerns brought up by landowners, by conservative landowners who have deep concerns about the use of eminent domain to come through their properties to site a pipeline. Obviously, there are questions around the greenhouse gas emissions associated with a pipeline. There's new questions emerging about, what communities pipelines pass through. These are all things that we're going to have to debate and wrestle with. I'm supportive of the approach the commission took under my leadership in evaluating and approving pipelines, but I'm also cognizant that elections have consequences. I mentioned early on, the one big difference between the chair of the commission and a commissioner is the ability to set the agenda. If the chairman of the commission is not in favor of moving forward with a pipeline application, even if a majority of the commission supports moving forward, the chairman does not have to schedule that pipeline for a vote. And so the reality is I'm going to have to work with the new leadership of the commission on potential compromises that can move some of this infrastructure forward. But we're going to need it. And so I want to be in the breach having that conversation. One other thing that I think is being lost in this whole conversation around pipelines and pipeline permitting, you talk to anyone in the energy space and they are all in agreement that in order to accelerate the deployment of renewables and really expand clean energy use in this country, we need transmission lines. We're going to have transmission lines, long-haul transmission lines that are there that can bring the resources from sparsely populated areas where the wind blows and the sun shines to where the demand centers are. Well, if we take a bunch of steps to add red tape and bureaucratic obstacles to the siting of pipelines, those are going to apply to the build out of transmission lines as well. And so it'll be very interesting to see how these two uniform goals, making pipeline construction, more compliant with some of these policy shifts, how is that going to line up with the stated goal of building out a much more robust transmission network? These things can't occur in a vacuum, and I think people need to take a step back and understand that if you put up a bunch of obstacles to pipelines, those same obstacles are gonna pop up to transmission lines.
Yeah, that's true. You kind of reminded me of the other reason that I'm often a little down on wind and solar as a forcing function, right? It's like build it where it makes economic sense, and don't over subsidize it. But if you're like, look, we got to get it all from wind and solar, well, then you got to put all that wind and solar kind of out in the middle of nowhere, which means you got to invest in a lot of materials and construction to build the transmission lines to get it to where you need to get it. And you can't really do that efficiently. You lose power for every mile of transmission lines. That's a physical fact. So anyway, this is why I'm always more bullish on nuclear and trying to make the argument for it, and some of those other powered zero carbon generation mechanisms that I talked about. Here's a simple question. Maybe it's a simple question. So why doesn't FERC vote on the Keystone Pipeline? Why does Biden just get to cancel it? I don't think people understand that.
So we approve natural gas pipelines, oil. We set rates, terms, and conditions for oil pipelines, but we don't actually have the ability to approve oil pipelines. And here again, because you're crossing a border, there's a State Department role to play. Ironically, looking back during my tenure in the Senate, one of the bills that we kicked around circa 2012, 2013 was a bill to give FERC authority to examine Keystone. At the time, trying to marshal the 60 votes in the Senate to get it through, even when we had the majority, we thought we might have a shot at it, and that might be something that President Obama could have signed. It could have been an elegant way to give him cover to have FERC approve it and take it out of his hands, but we couldn't get the votes for the legislation.
Yeah, it's strange to me that a president has that much power over a given. Is it just international pipelines? Is that what it is?
there's a lot of dynamics with Keystone. You had a court case that out in Montana that put up obstacles, but ultimately, at the end of the day, I think it is that State Department role that empowers the Secretary of State and the administration, that they have the ultimate say.
It's just frustrating because it's not like they made a cost benefit argument. They didn't even try. I mean, it was just like, we don't like it. That was basically the reasoning. I mean, because if they did try to make a cost benefit argument, it'd be impossible. Like I said, that oil gets transported either way. It's going to less clean kind of production in China as opposed to the United States. It's just frustrating to have these debates because they do not have the facts on their side or the science, but they like to scream, listen to the science. It's very frustrating. All right, what else would we have? What are we missing before we wrap up? Anything?
Look, there's a lot happening in the energy space right now, and I think a lot of it is going to zero in on Texas. I was commenting to someone the other day that I saw a local news reporter in Maryland here talking about ERCOT as if it was like common terminology.
Yeah. It's become a battle cry for the left. Like we just, I guess the left loves control. It's a very strange psychological disposition, but it's a truth. Reliability is boring until it's not. Yeah. And unfortunately, we're going to be spending a lot of time, or fortunately, we need to, but there's going to be a lot of time and focus spent on examining what went wrong here and legitimately trying to make sure it doesn't happen again in the future. Yeah. And you've done a good job evading a lot of my questions, and I think you know more than you're willing to let on. But you're on the commission, so fine, Neil, I'll let it go. Because a lot of these questions have been answered, and I think we're painting a very good picture of what happened and what is needed. But the final report isn't out yet. And I will say, I remember you very forcefully saying at the beginning of all this, basically, everybody shut up. Nobody knows anything. Just shut the hell up. And that, what? Maybe we need more of that.
I use a different word than hell, but yeah.
Yeah. But we need more of that in policy debates. Just look, a lot of passion, not a lot of knowledge. Okay. And don't substitute the two. Don't conflate the two. They're different. We need a little less of that and a little more of what you're saying. Just a sober look at the facts and then make an argument. You might still disagree, but at least you're making arguments as opposed to just emotional outbursts, which seems to be very prevalent in our politics today. So, Neil,
I second that.
Appreciate you, man. Thanks for coming on, and thanks for the work you do.
Thank you for everything you do, for your service to our country, and I love this podcast. And
it's the best podcast.
Thanks for having me back on.
Some people say it's the best. That's why they give it 5 stars.
You listen to my buddy Josh Holmes on the Ruthless podcast. I got to give him a plug. He's killing it over there.
Okay, I'll go listen to that one. Have you given this one 5 stars?
Yeah, definitely.
That was a lie. I can tell. I used to interrogate people for a living. Come on.
5 stars.
Do it right now if you haven't. Doesn't sound like I knew you were.
Right
so you did lie.
No, of course I already. No, I had to turn my phone off. It was ringing.
Yeah, right. Hey, all right. Appreciate it, Neil. It's good to see you, man.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Hey, have a good one.